The applause had barely died down when the moment happened. Under the blinding studio lights, cameras still rolling, and a nervous audience unsure whether to laugh or gasp, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett turned her back on Jimmy Kimmel. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged, and it wasn't the kind of moment late-night TV producers pray for. It was raw, sharp, and shocking, the kind of gesture that makes everyone in the control room drop their headsets and whisper, "Did that just happen?" The late-night stage has always been a peculiar battlefield. It pretends to be a place for laughter, for celebrity anecdotes and musical interludes. But underneath the layers of applause and monologue jokes, it is an arena where reputations can be forged or shattered in a single exchange. That night, when Jasmine Crockett walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's set, the air already carried that peculiar heaviness, the sense that what was about to happen might not stay confined to the boundaries of entertainment. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. Kimmel, seasoned as he was, felt it too. The teleprompter glowed, the cue cards rested neatly on his desk, the band readied a cheerful riff, and yet there was something brittle in the air. Crockett had not come to play along. She had come with her own agenda, her own stagecraft, honed in the combative hearings of Congress where a misstep is replayed on cable news for weeks. This wasn't just another talk show guest. This was a politician who understood that every camera is a weapon, every silence a soundbite, every angle a battlefield. The audience, a blend of starstruck fans and tourists hoping to glimpse Hollywood magic, expected the usual choreography. They wanted banter about Washington absurdities, a joke or two about Trump's latest post, maybe a playful jab at media bias. What they got instead was a collision, the collision of late-night tradition and political theater. And then it happened. Crockett's deliberate, almost glacial turn away from Kimmel. A shift of the shoulders, a pivot of the spine, a quiet refusal to play the role assigned to her. It was not rage, not even sarcasm, but something colder and far more unnerving. Dismissal. She dismissed not just the question but the premise, not just the host, but the entire stage on which he Saturday. The effect was instantaneous. Laughter evaporated. Kimmel's smirk faltered. Producers backstage scrambled, their headsets crackling with frantic instructions. Stay on the wide shot, don't cut away. The band, trained to improvise, hesitated with their instruments raised but silent, unsure whether a drum roll or a funeral dirge was more appropriate. Cue the first joke. It was the only time in late-night history when the trombone player looked like he was waiting for Supreme Court confirmation. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. The moment was excruciating in its simplicity. Television thrives on noise, laughter, applause, witty back and forth. Silence, especially a silence created by rejection, is television's most terrifying ghost. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't even need words. By showing her back, she made the camera and the millions watching chase her absence. Kimmel, always quick with a quip, tried to wrest control back. "Is this Congress or is this comedy?" he asked, half laughing, half pleading. The line fell flat, not because it lacked wit, but because the audience knew the power dynamic had shifted. For once, the comedian wasn't steering the scene. The Congresswoman was. Backstage, the control room was chaos. Monitors flickered, assistants clutched clipboards. One producer reportedly muttered, "We've just gone from prime time to history class." Another whispered the question everyone was thinking. Do we cut to commercial, or do we let America watch this car crash in real time? Cue the second joke. Forget Netflix thrillers, the most suspenseful thing on TV that night was a swivel chair. But what made the moment resonate wasn't just the awkwardness, it was the uncertainty it revealed. What was Crockett signaling? Was she condemning Kimmel for past compromises? Was she rejecting ABC as a symbol of corporate cowardice? Or was she staging a symbolic protest against the very marriage of comedy and politics that late-night shows embodied? The ambiguity gave the gesture its power. Had she shouted or stormed off, it would have been spectacle. By simply turning, she created mystery. And in Washington, mystery is currency. It forces reporters to speculate, forces opponents to fumble for narratives, forces audiences to fill the silence with their own fears. As one journalist in the front row later confessed, "I didn't know whether to tweet that she was rude, brilliant, or both. So I tweeted all three." The uncertainty spread like smoke. On social media, users dissected the angle of her shoulders as if it were the Zapruder film. Did she turn fully or just halfway? Did she roll her eyes? Was the gesture rehearsed? Within hours, GIFs looped endlessly. Crockett's back to the camera, Kimmel's stunned face frozen in disbelief. The memes practically wrote themselves. Cue the third joke. The internet decided her back deserved its own congressional district population. Viral. What the audience saw as spontaneous drama, insiders recognized as deliberate theater. Crockett was not reckless, she was calculated. She understood that in the new ecosystem of politics, a gesture is worth 1,000 op-eds. A back turned on national television is not disrespect, it's disruption. And disruption is the raw material of power. So the stage that had been built on uncertainty, the shaky ground of comedy colliding with politics, became a launchpad. Crockett had used Kimmel's own show to reposition herself as something more than a guest, more than a politician. She had become the protagonist of the night, the headline, the meme, the message. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. And Jimmy Kimmel? For once, he wasn't the comedian in control. He was the punchline. Turning one's back on live television is never just a gesture. It's a dagger dressed as body language. And on that stage, Jasmine Crockett knew exactly where she was aiming. The sting wasn't only in the silence that followed, it was in what the silence implied. In that instant, she wasn't just rejecting Jimmy Kimmel's question. She was rejecting the entire hierarchy of the late-night world. A hierarchy in which the host is king and the guest is supposed to play along. For Kimmel, the blow cut deeper than any heckle. He had weathered criticism before, plenty of it. He had been mocked, boycotted, roasted by both left and right, and he always found a way to turn it into content. But this was different. Crockett didn't give him a setup to flip into a joke. She didn't even offer him outrage to parry. She gave him her back, and the absence of engagement is far more lethal than anger. Because anger still admits that you're worth fighting. A turned back says you're not worth the breath. Backstage crew members later described the mood as if someone had just walked out of their own birthday party. It wasn't that she yelled at him, one producer confided. It was that she treated him like wallpaper. And for a man who had built his career on being the centerpiece, being reduced to background stung like nothing else. Cue the first joke. They say the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And Crockett just served Kimmel a 5-course meal of it on national TV. But the sting went beyond ego. Symbolically, it undercut the entire premise of the show. Late-night hosts thrive on the illusion that they're the arbiters of wit, the conductors of conversation. Crockett shattered that illusion with a swivel. In doing so, she reminded everyone that control of the narrative doesn't always belong to the person holding the cue cards. Sometimes it belongs to the person who refuses to play. Kimmel tried to salvage it with humor, the way he always does. His quip about shoes got a ripple of laughter. But laughter out of pity is a comedian's worst nightmare. And the pity wasn't for Crockett, it was for him. Viewers could see it in his eyes. A man scrambling for footing on a stage that suddenly tilted away from him. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. Cue the second joke. In comedy, timing is everything. Unfortunately, Crockett's timing was perfect, and Kimmel's was 5 seconds late to his own funeral. What really burned was the context. Crockett had once defended Kimmel, calling his firing a political execution. She had practically made him a symbol of free speech under siege. For her now to turn her back on him was betrayal layered over symbolism, a rejection squared. It suggested that even allies could find him expendable, that his platform wasn't sacred, that his moment as a martyr for comedy was already fading. Political strategists saw it instantly. She just took his story and made it hers, one analyst said. In 30 seconds, she flipped from supporting character to protagonist. For Kimmel, who had always cast himself as the underdog fighting power, that role was suddenly stripped away. He wasn't the scrappy fighter anymore. He was the man left talking to the back of a chair. Cue the third joke. You know you've lost the room when even the chair looks like it's about to start its own podcast without you. And that's why it stung. Not because Kimmel couldn't handle a tough guest, he'd faced plenty. Not because Crockett was louder, she didn't have to be. It stung because in that moment, the narrative itself betrayed him. The story was no longer about Jimmy Kimmel, the host. It was about Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman who rewrote the rules of engagement with a single, silent gesture. The ripple didn't take long to arrive. In fact, it was more like a tidal wave disguised as a tweet. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, reporters in the studio audience had already fired off the first digital shockwaves. Crockett turns her back on Kimmel stuns crowd. Another headline read, "Late Night Snub Heard Across Hollywood." The clip wasn't just circulating. It was multiplying, morphing, becoming 1,000 different narratives all at once. On social media, the response was instantaneous. Twitter threads dissected every frame like it was a Zapruder reel. Did she roll her eyes? Was her hand clenched? Was Kimmel's smirk fading before or after the swivel? TikTok edits paired the moment with dramatic soundtracks, everything from Beethoven's Fifth to Billie Eilish turning Crockett's back into a memeable performance piece. Instagram Reels froze the moment mid-turn, with captions like, "Talk to the back, America." Cue the first joke. When your posture becomes a trending topic, you know Pilates instructors across the country are drafting think pieces. Inside newsrooms, editors debated angles. Should they frame it as disrespect, as bravery, as political theater? At Fox, pundits branded it Crockett's meltdown, insisting she had humiliated herself. At MSNBC, anchors praised her for calling out a compromised media system. CNN tried to play referee, which, predictably, pleased nobody. The divide wasn't just between networks, it was within living rooms, dinner tables, and office break rooms. The question wasn't simply, "Did you see it?" but "What did it mean to you?" You're watching the latest, make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. For Jimmy Kimmel, the ripple was brutal. Overnight, his stunned face became the centerpiece of memes, some sympathetic, most not. One particularly viral one read, "When even Congress doesn't want to hear your jokes." He had been roasted before, but never with silence as the accelerant. Cue the second joke. Comedy rule number 1, don't bomb. Comedy rule number 2, if you bomb, pray your guest isn't the one lighting the fuse. For Crockett, the ripple was more complex. The move elevated her beyond the niche of political hearings and committee room clashes. Suddenly, she was a cultural figure, discussed not just by policy wonks but by pop culture commentators, meme pages, and late-night competitors. Fallon joked nervously about needing swivel-proof chairs. Colbert offered a sly monologue praising the courage to pivot. Myers, ever dry, muttered, "That's one way to avoid answering a question." The ripple turned into shockwaves in Washington. Lawmakers who hadn't watched late-night TV in years were shown the clip by aides. Some applauded her audacity. Others muttered she was grandstanding for clout, but nobody ignored it. Her silence, or rather, her refusal, became louder than most speeches delivered on the House floor that week. Cue the third joke. Imagine being a senator, spending 3 hours drafting a policy speech, only to be overshadowed by a half-turn of someone else's shoulders. Brutal. That's the thing about ripples. You never know what shore they'll crash against. For Crockett, the ripple extended her influence far beyond the Beltway. For Kimmel, it pulled him into waters where he no longer controlled the punchlines. And for America, it turned one swivel of a chair into yet another referendum on power, politics, and the uneasy marriage between comedy and truth. What made Crockett's backturn resonate wasn't the shock factor alone. Television is full of shocking moments, on-stage meltdowns, celebrity feuds, even the occasional wardrobe malfunction. What set this apart was the undertone, the deeper current flowing beneath the surface. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just brushing off a talk show host. She was reframing the entire relationship between politics, media, and truth. When she later stepped before reporters, the words she chose were carefully loaded. "When I turn my back," she said, "it's because the truth is behind me, not in the question being asked." The line was instantly quotable, cryptic enough to invite analysis, sharp enough to sting. Supporters read it as philosophy. Critics saw arrogance. Journalists saw a headline. But all agreed, it wasn't off the cuff. It was crafted. Cue the first joke. Some politicians prepare policy briefs. Crockett apparently prepares haikus with bite. The undertone here was power. In politics, refusing to engage can be more potent than a fiery rebuttal. Silence can be louder than shouting. And in a culture drowning in noise, Crockett's refusal to answer Kimmel turned into a kind of protest art minimalist, visual, impossible to misinterpret. She wasn't running from conflict. She was creating a new battlefield where she alone controlled the rules. That's what unnerved so many people. For conservatives, it looked like contempt for open dialogue. For liberals, it looked like a savvy act of resistance. For Kimmel, it looked like betrayal. And for neutral viewers, it looked like the kind of cryptic move that makes you wonder if you're missing the punchline. Cue the second joke. The internet was so busy decoding her posture, it's a wonder no one launched a Netflix docuseries called The Back Turn: Unsolved Mysteries. But beneath the memes and pundit panels, there was something else. Symbolism. Turning one's back on a question suggested that not all questions deserved answers, that some questions are designed to distract, to trivialize, to normalize power. Crockett's gesture challenged the assumption that every stage, every host, every network deserves legitimacy. It was, in essence, a refusal to endorse the game being played. That's what elevated the moment beyond gossip. It tapped into a cultural exhaustion with political theater disguised as comedy and comedy disguised as politics. Viewers could sense it. She wasn't snubbing Jimmy Kimmel the man, but Jimmy Kimmel the institution, the machine that had once mocked Trump relentlessly but now stood accused of bowing to pressure. Her back was turned not to an individual, but to an entire system she no longer trusted. Cue the third joke. If body language is a language, Crockett just wrote an op-ed with her spine. The deeper undertone of that night was not disrespect, but defiance. Defiance of expectations, of narratives, of the idea that laughter can paper over power. And whether you cheered or jeered, you couldn't deny it. In a world obsessed with noise, a single swivel had become a manifesto. For Jimmy Kimmel, the moment didn't just land, it lingered. A man who had built his career on quick wit, on taking awkward silences and bending them into punchlines, suddenly found himself stranded in one. The silence Crockett created wasn't a pause. It was a canyon. And Kimmel, for once, had no bridge. Eyewitnesses described his face as a mix of surprise and discomfort, the kind of look you might see on a man realizing mid-show that the teleprompter is blank. His trademark smirk faltered. He reached for his notes too late. He tried a quip too thin, and in those fleeting seconds, the host of a 2-decade-long institution looked like a guest on his own stage. Cue the first joke. In comedy, they tell you never to let them see you sweat. That night, Kimmel's sweat had its own close-up. You're watching the latest. Make sure to subscribe and tap that like button to stay informed. Backstage, producers watched the monitors with clenched jaws. Some motioned frantically for him to pivot, others whispered, "Let him ride it out." But the truth was clear. Crockett had seized the tempo, and the host was playing catch-up in his own house. Kimmel's eventual response, "Well, at least she didn't throw her shoe at me," earned polite chuckles, but it was the laughter of an audience trying to rescue him, not laughter he had earned. For a comedian, pity laughs sting worse than silence. They reek of sympathy, not delight. They remind you that, for once, the room isn't laughing with you, it's laughing at you. Or worse, for you. Cue the second joke. Sympathy laughs are the participation trophies of comedy, and Kimmel just got handed one on primetime TV. Later accounts suggested that Kimmel's unease extended well past the cameras. In the dressing room afterward, he reportedly shook his head and muttered, "What just happened?" A stagehand, trying to lighten the mood, offered, "Don't worry, Jimmy, at least you'll trend tonight." It didn't help. The look on his face wasn't the grin of a man going viral, it was the grimace of someone realizing why he was going viral. What stung most wasn't Crockett's gesture alone, but the reversal it represented. For years, Kimmel had been the one flipping power upside down, mocking presidents, skewering congressmen, reducing political giants to late-night punchlines. But in a twist of theatrical irony, it was now a politician who had reduced him to the punchline and without speaking a single word. Cue the third joke. If irony were a currency, that night Kimmel could have paid off the national debt. By the next morning, stills of his stunned expression dominated social media. His wide eyes, his slack jaw, his forced smile frozen forever in digital amber. Commentators replayed the footage in slow motion, dissecting every twitch, every blink, every nervous sip of water. For once, the man who had made a living analyzing others' discomfort became the specimen under the microscope. And in Hollywood, perhaps worse than being mocked is being overshadowed. Crockett's silence had stolen his spotlight. The late-night king had been dethroned, not by cancellation or scandal, but by the quiet refusal of a guest to face him. That was Kimmel's reaction, not a joke, not a jab, but a wound dressed in applause. Fallout is a funny word. It conjures images of mushroom clouds and scorched earth. But in the world of politics and media, fallout is quieter, subtler, and in some ways, far more corrosive. It seeps into headlines, creeps into Twitter feeds, and drips from the mouths of pundits until it becomes the background noise of daily life. And that's exactly what happened in the days after Jasmine Crockett turned her back on Jimmy Kimmel. The morning after, every network had its spin. Fox News blasted the clip on a loop, calling it proof that Crockett was unhinged and anti-free speech. MSNBC turned it into a victory lap, praising her refusal to play the game. CNN did what CNN always does, panel after panel, stacked with experts, arguing until viewers forgot what the question was in the first place. Cue the first joke. By the end of the CNN panel, the only consensus reached was that coffee refills should be tax-deductible. Meanwhile, the fallout on social media was volcanic. Hashtags multiplied like rabbits. BackturnGate, Free Jimmy, Crockett mic drop. TikTok was flooded with parodies. One viral clip showed a dog spinning its back to a bewildered owner, captioned, "Jasmine Energy." Memes turned Kimmel's stunned expression into the internet's new reaction phase, slapped on everything from sports losses to bad Tinder dates. Politicians, never ones to waste an opportunity, dove headfirst into the chaos. Republicans accused Crockett of staging a political stunt to distract from Democratic failures. Democrats were split. Some defended her, others privately worried she had handed the opposition a weapon. Independents, as usual, just wanted the noise to stop. Cue the second joke. Somewhere in America, a guy tried to explain the clip to his grandmother and gave up halfway, muttering, "It's like Watergate, but with swivel chairs." The fallout wasn't confined to headlines or hashtags. ABC itself felt the tremors. Inside the network, executives fretted over whether the scandal would alienate viewers already skeptical of late-night comedy's partisan slant. One anonymous insider leaked that the boardroom conversation included the phrase brand rehabilitation, which is corporate speak for how do we stop this dumpster fire from spreading to advertisers. And Jimmy Kimmel? His silence grew louder with each passing day. He issued no follow-up jokes, no interviews, no clarifications. His Instagram remained dormant except for one vague post of a sunset with the caption, "Perspective." Fans interpreted it as resilience. Critics called it retreat. But either way, the man who had once set the tone for political humor was now reduced to a silent participant in his own scandal. Cue the third joke. When your only comeback is a sunset photo, you've officially gone from late-night host to inspirational calendar. The broader fallout was cultural. Crockett's gesture became more than a viral moment. It became a litmus test. To some, she was a fearless truth-teller who refused to legitimize a compromised platform. To others, she was a grandstanding opportunist who disrespected free discourse. But to everyone, she was unforgettable. And in the age of digital robotics, unforgettable is its own form of victory. In the end, the drama between Jasmine Crockett and Jimmy Kimmel wasn't just about a single talk show moment. It was about the blurred lines that define modern America, where politics and entertainment have fused into a single, messy spectacle. Crockett's swivel of the shoulders didn't just reject Kimmel. It rejected the idea that late-night comedy was still a safe playground, detached from the machinery of power. The bigger picture was this. Crockett turned her back on more than a question. She turned her back on an institution that once prided itself on being the voice of the people, now suspected of bending under political pressure. In doing so, she voiced the unease. Many Americans already felt that media wasn't neutral, that truth was negotiable, and that laughter had become camouflage for control. Cue the first joke. When jokes stop feeling funny, it's usually because the punchline is paying rent in Congress. For Kimmel, the bigger picture was humbling. He had spent years lampooning power, but suddenly he was framed as part of it, a gatekeeper whose platform could be questioned, even dismissed. For ABC, it was terrifying. Networks thrive on predictability, and Crockett had just proven how quickly one gesture could turn stability into scandal. Cue the second joke. Imagine building a billion-dollar studio only to be undone by a quarter turn of a politician's chair. The bigger picture was also generational. Crockett belonged to a new breed of politicians fluent in virality, who understood that sometimes the most powerful statement is not what you say, but what you refuse to say. And in that, she reminded America that control of the narrative is never fixed. It can shift in a heartbeat or in a back turned. The lights dimmed, but the echo of that moment still hung heavy in the air. The studio crew packed up cables, the band shuffled off stage, and Jimmy Kimmel sat a little longer at his desk than usual, staring at the empty guest chair as though it had just delivered the knockout punch. What was supposed to be another night of predictable laughter had ended as a referendum on power. Jasmine Crockett left the set like a prizefighter who didn't throw a single punch but still won the round. Reporters swarmed her outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. She didn't give them sound bites. She gave them silence, a knowing smile that said, "You'll write the story for me." And they did. By dawn, her swivel was already immortalized in headlines and memes. Cue the first joke. They say history is written by the victors, but in 2025, it's written by whoever has the best Wi-Fi connection. Kimmel, meanwhile, became the reluctant supporting character in his own saga. A man once armed with monologues sharper than editorials had been undone by a gesture with no words at all. For a host who had thrived on controlling the punchline, the irony was unbearable. He had become it. ABC executives scrambled to control the damage, drafting statements, convening crisis calls, debating whether the scandal could be spun into sympathy. But the truth was simpler and harsher. Crockett owned the moment. Cue the second joke. If late-night TV were a boxing match, this was the first time a fighter lost to someone who literally turned away from the ring. And so the closing scene was written not in applause, but in silence. A silence louder than laughter, heavier than booze. A silence that asked the only question that mattered. Who really holds the microphone now?